Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from verses 20 through 40 in the 16th chapter in the book of Acts. We're going to review what takes place before we comment more detailed and on every one. So in the earliest verse, we meet a man named Timothy. He is half Greek, half Jewish. He would be part of Paul's family. He was a surrogate father to him, a spiritual father of sorts. He was a pastoral protege to whom he wrote two pastoral epistles, and he made a point not to even though his mother was Jewish, but his father was Greek, he wasn't circumcised, and he made it a point to circumcise it, because at this stage of the spread of the good news, this is during his second missionary journey, from 49 to 52 AD, he decides to have him circumcised to silence any controversy between the Jews, because this was sort of a big deal in early Christianity, the question of circumcision, and as long as the Jews were in the majority, which they perhaps were at this point, but when the Gentiles displaced them as another point, he goes out of his way to not circumcise Titus, who is the other pastoral protege, to receive an inspired epistle directed to his name. And then in the verse 5, we just read that the good news, the Great Commission, of which you read of in chapter 1, verse 8, is succeeding masterfully, thoroughly, and marvelously. Then indeed the assemblies were strengthened in the faith and increased in number every day. So there's a qualitative growth, and also a quantitative growth. Being strengthened in the faith and increasing is the quantitative measure. And then Paul's really trying to make his way into Asia Minor, but the Spirit forbids him. He is Spirit guided. He goes where he is sent to go, but the Spirit tells him no and directs him to a vision, through a vision, to go in Macedonia, which a man in Macedonia tells him, come over to Macedon and help us. And when he saw the vision, immediately sought to go to Macedon, concluding that the master had called him to bring the good news to them. So the good news is spreading to the European continent for the first time ever. And we today think of Christianity as a white man's religion, a European born religion, but it was actually born in Asia, and it was tricontinental. But little known fact, the Muslims actually control 60% of what once was the Roman Empire. So it survived in Europe, not so much in Asia and Africa. Then from Troas, and then he makes his way down to Philippi, which was the city named after the father of the king of Macedon, Alexander the great conqueror. This city was named after him. He was a one-eyed man. He had lost his eye in a battle, but he was the one who had united the hitherto ununitable tribes of Greece, which functioned as city-states and autonomous units for the entirety of their history at this point. And it was also the site of the battle between the forces of Mark Antony and the one who became known as Caesar Augustus. He was known as Octavian, though. That's where he triumphed over. They collectively triumphed over the Republican forces led by Cassius and Brutus. And they stayed, to return to the passage, they stayed there for a few days. There they also meet a woman by the name of Lydia, who was a worshiper of Elohim, who heard the message, and her heart was opened by the master to pay attention to what Paul had to say. She heard what he had to say. She liked what he had to say. She wanted to hear more about what Paul had to say, the message he came, proclaimed, and delivered. So this woman was fully sold and instantly converted. And then then we witness an exorcism of a woman in the town of Philippi. Philippi had 10 synagogues, so that was all that was took. There was some Jewish population there, and that's where Paul goes mostly to preach at this point. Of course, we find him there in the Berea, but in Athens we find him at the Areopagus in the 17th chapter. But he successfully expels the demon, the indwelling demon, and the money making was gone, much like the idol makers at Ephesus, of whom we meet in the 19th chapter. His free services threatened their livelihood, and so they seized Saul and Silas. That was Paul's ministerial traveling companion during the second journey, and dragged him straight into jail. And then the 20th verse, the first we're going to read and comment on, reads, "And having brought them to the captains, they said, These men, being Jews, greatly disturb our city, and they proclaim practices which are not right for us to receive, nor to do, being Romans. Now Judaism and Christianity were not yet distinguished as separate sects at this point. The Jews was a protected religion, the Christianity was not, because the Jews belonged to a people they belonged to a people they had conquered, and it was theirs when they conquered it. And the Romans were a religiously tolerant people. They subscribed to the ancient practice of polytheism, where the deities were to be respected in their own home, and not because that would invite cursings if you curse them in their own territory. And the crowd rose up together against them, and the captains tore off their garments and commanded them to be beaten with rods. So they had committed a crime worthy of public beating. So this is more severe than an ordinary crime, shall we say, because this is not, most criminals aren't publicly beaten once convicted. And having laid many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them safely. So not only did they beat them publicly, they tossed them into a dungeon, tossed them into a prison. This is a first century Roman prison, perhaps a much less pleasant place than a first century prison. And of course, the jailer's job is to keep them safely. That means keep them there, make sure they don't go anywhere, and to fail in this duty could invite one's death penalty. And this incidentally comes in the story we're going to be reading. Who, having received such a command, put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. So he took all precautionary measures. He made sure their feet were glued to the ground in the stocks, and that they were in the inner prison. That would have been in the prison inside the prison, the most secure location, the least likely to be escaped from. And not only that, but their feet are glued to the ground, that they can't get up, they can't move. So he had done his job, even though it was as if he hadn't done his job, as it unfolds. And at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing songs to Elohim, and the prisoners were listening to them. So there's such a thing as a song in the night. We read of this in Job 35:10 or somewhere thereabouts. That's day and night. We should always be thinking, praying, and praising, and singing, and thanking, and thinking, and dwelling on Elohim, because he who watches over us does not sleep nor slumber. He does not rest for us. He allows us to rest, which is an act of his grace, but he himself is an indefatigable being, unlike Baal, for example, as Elijah taunted them in 1 Kings 18:27. So to be thinking of him and singing on him at all times and at all places is a good thing to do. And suddenly a great earthquake took place, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and all the chains came loose. So we can gather that it wasn't just Paul and Silas, but everyone in the prison, and it's because of this earthquake which shook the place and literally unlocked and unglued these locks and connectors and holders and things that rendered something bound and inescapable. They came loose suddenly, and it was a result of this earthquake around them, which shook the foundations of what once held them together. And the jailer, awakening from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, thinking the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. So this jailer, he was sleeping, so he was derelict in his duty. A jailer is supposed to be awake if he's on shift and on guard and on the payroll. But he is asleep, and even though this earthquake is none of his fault, he'll still have to answer it because his job and his life depend on him keeping the prisoners there. So he was going to save his superiors the trouble of having to kill himself and just kill himself prematurely. So he is at death's door, and willingly so, and it's all because he had woke up to see this calamity, this unanticipated calamity, which he had slept through, and even though he could have no wise prevented it, he had still stepped through, so he thought he was a goner, and he was the one who was going to make himself gone. But Paul came with a loud voice, saying, Do no harm to yourselves, for we are all here. So Paul shouts as loud as he can across the room. He makes sure his voice is heard and known, and tells him that, we are all here. We have not all escaped. We are just the building his foundation. We are still here. Do not put that sword away. It's not necessary. You don't need to kill yourself. Your life's not over, and not only that, but you have a second lease on life, which I'm going to offer you momentarily. And asking for a light, he ran in and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. So he was in the dark. We can imagine all the candles were extinguished during this earthquake, and he has a light which leads him straight to Paul and his missionary traveling companion, and he's trembling. He's afraid because his life is on the line, because to fail in one such duties was a crime punishable by death, or a mistake, or a dereliction of duty, or a violation of one's contract that one would have to pay for their life with if they let an entire prison of people under their watch escape. And having led them outside, he said, Masters, what do I have to do to be saved? So because he's on death's door, and the questions of salvation grow all the more acute with the passage of life, when this life that you have is sort of slipping away, your mindfulness, and when you realize you're at death's door, this question is going to be on your mind: what must I do to be saved? It is a question that is best asked before the deathbed. So this question ought to be constantly on our mind every second and minute we have, not that much, but daily at least. What must I do to be saved? This is a question worthy of all consideration, and sneak peek, there's nothing you can do to be saved. You can work your fingers by the grave to the bone, But that will not save you. We are not saved by doing anything. We are saved by grace through faith. So we must believe, and I think that forms the first word of Paul's answer. And they said, believe on the Master Yahshua Messiah, and you shall be saved, and you and your household. So it's not only believe or have faith, but it's to have faith in a certain one. That is the Master Yahshua Messiah. He is the way to salvation. Without him, he is the only way back to the Father. He is the only name by which we must be saved, Acts 4:12. He alone paved the path. He alone paid the price. He alone was constitutionally capable of procuring our salvation. And if this jailer believed in him, not only will his atoning power be efficacious for him, but also for his entire household or family. And they spoke the word of Yahweh to him and to all who were in his house. Now, in all likelihood, they didn't have access to an Old Testament or a Bible or anything like it. So the word of Yahweh isn't always necessarily limited to a word in this book. It can be a word that he has for that moment in time, which is not going to be found in this book, but will be appropriate for that occasion. And when you're walking and living and working and abiding in the will and the work of Yahweh, you will have that intimate connection where he will speak to you and give you that word of Yahweh to tell everyone, not only, but everyone in the room, all those who are in his house. And telling him that in that hour of the night he washed their wounds, and immediately he was baptized, and all that were his. So he did, in fact, enter a death experience. A baptism is a suicidal experience where we signalize a death to our former self, the old self, the sin nature. It's sin. It's unrepented of, unregenerated form of unconfessed and unrepented of sins. When we are baptized, we recognize that the power of salvation can be attained. It's not completely necessary, but this public confession of our identification with the source of our salvation, I personally don't believe it's completely necessary for our salvation, but I do believe it is mandatory. If one has the opportunity, you should go through it, but there are rare circumstances and hypotheticals where one may not have the opportunity to be baptized and be lived. I was 7 years old in Christian years before I was baptized, and the story is neither here nor there why, but that just goes to show, had I died at any point in between now and then, honest appraisal, I have full confidence that I'd be in heaven. But we're going to return to Acts, and where were we? And having brought them into his house, he put food before them, and he rejoiced without the household, having believed in Elohim. And they're actually before that. And having taken them in that hour of the night, he washed their wounds, and immediately so verse 34 is the one we haven't read. So food and eating is just hospitality. This is a friendly occasion. He baptizes him and feeds him and hosts him, and not only him but his whole house. And they are rejoicing because that day marks a birthday of sorts. They have been born again unto a newness of life, and that is their first birthday of the new born-again life. So even though He had planned to die. He wanted to die. He had a sword in hand, ready to do it himself. He ended up dying, in some sense, in the metaphorical baptism. And and when day came, the authorities sent the officers, saying, "Let these men go." So he was worried about his life because of how his superiors, in whom had the power of life and death over him for such a derelict of duty, might respond. But he was content to get baptized, but he also was given another opportunity on life on them. He's telling them to let these men go. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The captains have sent to let you go. Now then, come out and go in peace." But Paul says, "Wait just a minute, go in peace. I actually have a controversy to settle with you. There's something you didn't know about me. I'm a Roman citizen, and as such, I cannot be beaten in public or arrested without a trial or due process." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly uncondemned, being Romans, and they have thrown us into prison. And now do they throw us out secretly? No, indeed. Let us come themselves and bring us out." So the secrecy was what the big insult was. They did it in public, and now they were going to throw them out secretly without a record, without a publicizing of it. And they had done a crime that they had to answer, which is more than Paul could say. So he's going to make them answer for it. And having come, they pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to leave the city. So they just want them to go away and stay away. You know, you've caused enough trouble. You guys are troublemakers. I know you're perhaps not by nature, but nevertheless, trouble gravitates around you whichever way you go and wherever you are. So please get out and leave the city. So coming out of the prison, they went to Lydia, and seeing the brothers, they encouraged them and went forth. So Lydia is the dye maker of purple, of whom we met earlier in the chapter, verses 14, a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, a worshiper of Elohim who heard, and her heart was open to pay attention to what Paul said. They retreat to her house from the prison, so they don't actually leave the city. They're still they still spend some time, but they leave discreetly, because in the 17th chapter we read them going across the city of Macedon, of which Philippi was a city. They make their way to Berea and Thessalonica, which incidentally has 2 epistles written to it. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.